Hey guys, welcome back to the video. I just got to watch Black Panther Wakanda Forever. In this video, you guys my spoiler review and breakdown of the entire movie. Like my other spoiler reviews, this is going to be more of a discussion, so sit back, grab a snack, and get ready to talk about Black Panther Wakanda Forever. If you haven't already seen the movie, you can check out my spoiler-free review, which will be linked in the description down below. And before we get to the videos and you're in here, make sure to subscribe and notification bell so you don't miss any time I upload a new video or I go live. But wasting more time, let's get into it. As always, you can skip to specific things I'm talking about with the timestamps in the description down below, but I want to start off this video by talking about Shuri / the Black Panther mantle in this movie, because the opening to this movie just sets the tone perfectly. It is sad, depressing. It was just jarring. I mean, obviously, the movie opens up with Chadwick Boseman's T'Challa dying, and obviously we don't see the death of T'Challa, but it's pretty much implied. I mean, he's dying with an illness. Shuri is trying to save him, but can't. And this pops up later in the movie with her trying to deal with these gifts that she's been given, but you can't even use them properly. And that is one thing that just really stuck with me throughout this entire movie, is the fact that this character was given this much power, this much intelligence, and she couldn't help the one person that she wanted to help. And that really stuck with me throughout this entire movie. It's something that was really sad. And I think on an emotional level, yeah, this movie did hit for me, but it didn't really hit until the end, when you kind of saw Shuri go through these phases and actually have to learn and go through these like flashback moments where she's kind of recollecting all of her memories and becoming the best version of herself. And that's what this movie is really about. I mean, the theme of loss for this movie is insane. I mean, the way that they just play out this story is so great. And I'm going to talk specifically about the story in just a second, but I want to talk about this theme of loss in the movie because it's just heartbreaking. I mean, again, the movie starts off super sad and somber with the death of T'Challa, and then the Marvel opening itself is just straight silence. It's just wind blowing, and it's all Chadwick Boseman throughout the entire Marvel logo. And I do believe there's a connection between the opening and the very ending of this movie, and I think that is that whenever the wind is blowing, I think that's to represent the closure at the end of the movie whenever Shuri is on the beach and she's burning her white clothes that she wore to T'Challa's funeral. I think it's kind of like a full circle type of thing, where that wind blowing is that silence, and that's when she has those flashbacks of King T'Challa in her life. And I think that is just such a powerful moment. I'm gonna be honest, I'm gonna talk about the ending later at the end of this video, but I will say that ending is where I started to tear up and started to cry. I didn't really tear up or anything like that throughout the entirety of the movie. I was definitely very unsettled at the deaths throughout this movie, and obviously, there's the death of Queen Ramona as well in the middle of the movie, and that one really did hit, but I really wasn't like overwhelmed with emotion until the very end. And I think they chose the perfect spot to insert Chadwick Boseman into this movie. We don't see him at all. I thought that they were going to do like flashbacks or something like that in the very beginning. We see him in the Marvel logo, and then we see him at the very end when Shuri is burning her clothes, and that really just hit for me. Like I was full on sobbing. Like I could not control my tears, and I don't even know what it was, because I was like, I got through the whole movie and I was like, oh dang, we're really not going to have that many emotions flowing here. Like, we're feeling sad on the inside, but no tears. And then we get to those final 2 minutes in that post-credit scene, and I was bawling my eyes out. I don't know what it was. I think it was just the way this movie comes and goes, like the way that it becomes a full circle type of thing with the theme of loss and how you get from point A to point C at the end of this movie. That whole like transition between point A to C, when you have B in that middle part is just so heartbreaking. I don't know how to describe it properly. I mean, just speaking on like specific moments that made me feel that way and that big theme of loss, considering what I'm saying like point B as, I would say like the biggest thing for me, the thing that like kind of shifted this movie the most, was not only the Queen Ramona's death, but also her seeing Killmonger in the ancestral plane or inside of the actual kingdom. That's where it hit for me. And Michael B. Jordan's performance there is just absolutely phenomenal. I was really hoping that he'd be in this movie because I felt like this was a great place to insert him back in, and they did a cool way, like just the creative side of this movie, which again I'm going to talk about in a second. I know I keep jumping around, but that's what these discussion videos are. But I definitely do think that the way they insert all of this stuff, the ancestral plane, and the way of her actually becoming the Black Panther, the way that that's all used throughout this movie is perfect in terms of the theme of loss, because you have this like rage building inside of her. And I was thinking for a moment in the movie when Queen Ramona died, Shuri might just be the character that's lost the most. I mean, Wakanda literally had to relocate after her own mother died. In the beginning of the same movie, her brother died, and then her dad died just a few years prior. Like, there is so much happening in this person's life. And the fact that they are also a lot younger than characters like Wanda and Thor, they're much much less emotionally stable. And so I think that all, like, if you put all factors into play, Shuri might be the character that's lost the most, and you can definitely tell that throughout this movie. I do quickly, before I move on to the story stuff, I want to talk about Shuri and like just Letitia Wright as the character, because she's phenomenal. I mean, we know Letitia Wright caused a lot of behind the scenes problems. I don't want to speak on a lot of it right now. I think we all know what I'm talking about here. But all that aside, she puts on a phenomenal performance as Shuri here, as the Black Panther. I also do want to say Black Panther in this movie is phenomenally done. The way they build up to it and the performance that Letitia Wright gives, it makes it feel deserved. It makes it feel like I had this little grudge going into this movie. I was like, okay, how are they gonna make it feel like Shuri actually deserves this mantle that she's gonna be given after T'Challa's passing? And I think the time jump #1 was a great move. That 1 year time jump was a phenomenal choice by the creative team. But also the fact that Queen Ramonda dies and all this other stuff, there was just so many little things that build up throughout this movie where it's like, okay, she has to become the Black Panther now, and it feels deserved. It feels earned. And I'm very happy with the way they built up Shuri's character. And again, I think Letitia Wright's, her performance is just absolutely phenomenal in this movie. Again, personal stuff aside, she is a phenomenal actress in this one. I do want to move on now to talk about the story itself. I mean, obviously this goes into the theme of loss because that's literally what this entire movie is. But this is kind of where I get into my first little issue with the movie, which is the pacing. I think it's paced in a general sense well, but I did feel the runtime. It's one of the longer movies. It's like 2 hours and 45 minutes. I think 162 minutes, whatever that comes out to be. And I think another very long superhero movie in comparison to this here is The Batman. The Batman, though I was even more excited for it than this one, that one went by super quickly. But this movie felt like it was forever. Maybe it's because it was so emotionally hard hitting. Maybe it's because there was so many big event moments, but also so many small and slow, just like drawn out emotional moments. I mean, there was so much happening here, but it still somehow just felt like it dragged on. I mean, I'm rewatching it, so hopefully second time it doesn't feel like it dragged, and I don't think it will the second time, but I don't know, maybe it was just so much happening and it was like slow emotional moments, but I feel like maybe they were just weirdly placed within the bigger event moments of this movie. It just didn't feel right to me. The pacing was off like most of the time, but I will say in terms of big event moments, that's where I really want to praise this movie, because it does a good job of balancing the amount of event moments and the amount of actual close, personal, and very slow moments, because especially in the beginning of this movie, and I'll talk specifically about Namor and the Talokan people and that city and all that kind of stuff. I'll talk about that later in this video, but just the creative side of how they switch scenery and how they go back and forth. I mean, literally the first act of this movie, you go to so many places, so much stuff happens. Still somehow everything feels supernatural, and the creative side of it, everything feels like it just flows very well in terms of how you're expanding these worlds, how you're talking about, the United Nations, which I'll talk about later in this video. Obviously, the Talokan people, all of this Wakanda lore. There's just so much happening in this movie that I just can't help but credit the creative side, because I will also say this movie might just be one of the most creative movies story-wise in the MCU. I mean, obviously, we know they had so much stuff behind the scenes going on. It was an absolute whirlwind. Not even Marvel knew about Chadwick Boseman's passing like ahead of time. And so they were just thrown into the deep end with this story, and it's kind of interesting to see what they came out of the deep end with. I mean, they came out with a lot of creative stuff, and again, that's what I want to commend this movie on, because the story itself feels super unique. It doesn't feel like just a basic war between the worlds type of story. It feels like something that's deeply personal, and I think it's because of our backstory with Namor and this connection with Shuri and Namor about this theme of loss. Quickly, before we go on and talk about Namor and the Talokan people, I do want to talk about the twists in this movie. I mean, obviously, Queen Ramonda's death, I think, is the biggest twist in this one, and I was expecting another character death throughout this movie, but I wasn't expecting it to be Queen Ramonda for some reason. I mean, the trailers kind of gave me a hint towards that. It was kind of like whenever Namor comes up to the window and stuff like that kind of gave me like, okay, Ramonda might die, but she was next to Riri, so I was like, oh no, if one dies, it wouldn't make sense if both die, but she ended up dying. It was very heartbreaking. That one, so glad I didn't get it spoiled for me at all. I wasn't expecting it at all, and I thought it was a great story choice, especially for motivating Shuri. Like I said before, I think Shuri was very deserving of this Black Panther mantle throughout this movie, and I think they do a good job of building that all up, and I think it wouldn't have been the same if it wasn't for Queen Ramonda's death. Seeing two funerals at the same movie for people that were just as close to each other to Shuri is absolutely insane. but it's the perfect use of character development, character motivations, and that's what really pushes Shuri over the edge, and that's why I really like this theme of loss, because at this point, Shuri is like, I'm here for vengeance, like, I'm going to kill. And then obviously, you know, we see Killmonger in the ancestral plane, and all of that just, it comes together very well. I think they do a good job of just building everything up and making everything feel like it's actually worth it, and all these small little pieces, all of the Queen Ramonda's death, meeting Killmonger in the ancestral plane, as well as seeing Shuri's path of madness pretty much of this entire thing. At a certain point, Shuri was sounding like a villain, and I think that's what crafts the perfect story. But now I want to move on and talk about Namor and the Talokan people. I want to say right out of the gate, I think Namor is one of the best MCU villains. I think he's top 3. I think a rewatch will solidify him in the top 3, but I do believe he is top 3 MCU villains. I think what's unique about him is the fact that he feels like a copycat villain in terms of motivations. It feels like there is the same end goal, not between the Talokan and Wakanda, but between Shuri and Namor. And I think that's what's very interesting throughout this movie, is that theme of loss is what connects our two hero and villain, but at the same time, it's not necessarily in the same way. And by the end, we see Namor does end up living. We see the way that Shuri decides not to kill off Namor. And I think they do a really good job of just making everything feel worth it. I mean, Marvel has this problem of killing off their villains, and I think it's a huge issue in the MCU. It's probably one of my least favorite tropes in the entire MCU, is killing off your villains so fast, especially like characters like Gore the God Butcher, who were just done such a disservice in Thor Love and Thunder, and then they're just killed off and you're never seeing them again. Christian Bale's a phenomenal actor. I'd love to see him back, but Tenoch Huerta, I think that's how you pronounce his name, he is going to come back as Namor sometime in the future because of the ending of this movie, and I really like that. I mean, he is a straight up villain in this movie to Wakanda, but at the same time, like, they do a good job of balancing that fine line of like, yes, he is a villain. Yes, he literally killed Queen Ramonda. But Shuri makes that decision of, okay, I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here to make Wakanda a better place. I am the leader of Wakanda now. And seeing that full path for Shuri throughout this entire movie was just stellar. I think what makes Namor such an interesting villain is the fact that he doesn't necessarily like threaten Shuri right away. He's actually trying to convince her of the sins that the surface world has committed. And I think that's a really cool villain choice in the way that they do that. I definitely thought Atuma was going to end up being the main villain, and that was my prediction going in the movie. And I didn't know that Namor was going to end up being like the villain of this movie. And obviously by the end, we do see the Talokan people. They are frustrated with Namor because he yielded to Wakanda, but Namor kind of paints it as he yielded to them, and so now he has their trust, and they're not allies per se, but they trust each other, and then they can use that trust in order to basically rule the surface world and kind of make war with the surface world. And I think that's a very interesting premise. I don't know how it's going to work story-wise necessarily for the future of the Talokan people and stuff like that, just because if you're battling the surface world, I feel like a lot of other heroes, I mean, obviously, you know, in the MCU, you have to suspend your disbelief in terms of what heroes are where at what time, right? But I feel like surface world versus like ocean world, I feel like that's a pretty big thing. Like, that's a pretty big battle, and I don't think that can just go unnoticed. I mean, we have stuff in the MCU that's bigger that's gone unnoticed, but I think that would be something of a bigger event, so I don't think that's necessarily what they're going for in the future with Namor's character. But more on like the Talokan in general, I think Atuma was also a great character, and the lore of the Talokan was also very interesting to me. That's what really kept me engaged with these underwater sequences. Not only like how beautiful it was, I mean, it's like, okay, here's the thing, visually it was great. But the thing is, after seeing the Avatar Way of Water, you know what I'm saying? The Avatar Way of water, like effects, stuff like that. It's nothing compared to that. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that's like 90% virtual reality. So that's a different story. But what they did here, it looked great. And I love the creative choices of like, they turn blue when they get out of water. I think that's so cool. I mean, the masks, just their design. I mean, the set design in general is phenomenal in this movie. And I think the Talokan people proved that. I mean, obviously, Wakanda, we know from the first movie, the costume design is absolutely insane. But them doing it for two different worlds and making these two distinct styles, and the way it all works together is so really, it's just really well done. It's all very cohesive, because it's two worlds that are not like the surface world. Because I mean, Wakanda's on the surface world, but Wakanda is like a separate world within itself, and so is obviously the Talokan. And I think like the Talokan city, I think that's a very cool premise of like, they want to team up because they're two unknown worlds. The surface world doesn't really know about Talokan like that, and even at the end of the movie they don't. And so I think it's a good way to just balance these different power dynamics throughout the entire world and these different worlds within the world. And I don't know, I just think it's very cool. The world building, I guess I'm trying to say, is what makes this movie really unique on the story and creative side. And I think Namor is the perfect gateway to that in terms of like meshing Wakanda to the Talokan to the real world. And that's what I mean by like Namor is one of my favorite MCU villains at this point, is because he accomplishes so much, not only like his personal motives wise, but also to Shuri, to the rest of the world, to the Talokan people. He has such a rich backstory, and it's all also explained very well. Yes, it's done through like pretty chunky exposition dumps, but at the same time, I think it's well placed in the movie to where it's like, okay, you feel really bad for him, and then he starts to threaten Shuri, and then you're like, okay, like where are we going with this? But I think it works because you feel so invested in this, like Namor is like going to the surface world for the first time to bury his mom, and then he sees all of his people as slaves, and then he wants to kill all of these people, and now he wants to wage war with the surface world. And that whole story and the way that all plays out is super cool to me. I don't know, I really like it. I feel like I could talk about Namor and the Talokan for a very long time. I just think they're very interesting characters. I think it's a very interesting world, and I'm excited and I'm very happy that the MCU didn't kill Namor off here, because I do think he could be a big part of the MCU's future. And Tenoch Huerta is a great actor as Namor, and I think this role is meant for him, and I'm again very excited for his future. I do quickly want to mention the surface world stuff, because obviously, we have the stuff with the Talokan, we have the stuff with the Wakandians, but obviously there's still surface world drama here, and the main thing is Agent Ross. And we know, okay, so here's the thing, I was really confused when Valentina showed up here, because that just threw me for a loop. I was not expecting her here, and I was like, okay, who is she trying to recruit? What is happening? I'm going to be honest, I still have no clue. I haven't watched any spoiler reviews or breakdowns or anything like that, so someone's probably already cracked the code to why she's in this movie. And obviously, we see that she has a backstory with Agent Ross. I'm pretty sure they used to be married, if I'm not mistaken, but like that backstory is all cool, but like, why else was she here? Agent Ross's story, like, I think he like affected the story in a good way. He was a plot device like Riri Williams, which I'll talk about in just a second, which I by the way, I loved Riri Williams in this movie, and again, I'll talk about her in just a second. But Agent Ross was definitely a plot device to move it forward. But Valentina, she felt kind of out of place here for me. It's definitely more like just setting up future MCU stuff, and it was cool, but like some stuff felt really random, like, oh, I tapped into the Wakandan beads and I've heard every conversation you're having. And then obviously by the end, Agent Ross gets released by one of the Dora Milaje characters. I'm blanking on her name right now, but it's like you have these two different things. Like, why did any of this actually happen? Like, it makes no sense to me, and it felt very pointless to me. But it obviously, it's for future stuff. Like, I'm not gonna, it's not necessarily for this movie. It's classic MCU. We're building up to the next thing. That's all fine with me. But I just thought it was interesting. I thought Agent Ross's inclusion was obviously needed because he was a big part and a great part of the first movie. But I thought his inclusion here definitely was just strictly for world building purposes, and I wasn't necessarily a fan of that. And the last thing I want to mention about the surface world stuff is the UN meeting in the beginning of the movie, because that was phenomenal. And I just quickly want to talk about that scene where they replay the people like entering the ship of the Wakanda like weapons facility thing, and then they play those events out as Queen Ramona is talking about that event, and then the Dora Milaje bring the people in that invaded, and just the way they play those events out, it might just be one of my favorite sequences in the entire MCU in terms of just story stuff. Like, the way they played out is elite cinema. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. It felt so random the way she brought it up, and then you see this happening, and then you're like, okay, how does this connect? And then you slowly, piece by piece by piece, everything just gets together. Like, that is so great. And the final thing I want to talk about before I speak on the mid-credit scene is Riri Williams, because I want to save this for last, because I genuinely think she was one of the funniest characters in the entire MCU. She's been in one movie, and she made me laugh more than like 90% of the other MCU characters. Like, she is absolutely hilarious. I don't know why her character alone just like made me so happy. My theater was laughing so much at these small jokes and moments, not laughing at the like character because it was dumb, but like they were laughing at these jokes and they were laughing at these moments. And within such a heartbreaking story, Riri Williams added so much light to it in such a great and honestly like respectful way. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, because again, it is a very depressing and dark, heartbreaking movie, and it's like that for a reason. I mean, we're mourning the passing of a real life person, and that character has also died in the movie, and just everyone feels the effects of it, right? But Riri Williams is that light in this movie, and you can feel it the moment she's on screen for the first time. I mean, there are some corny moments, but I think it works. Like 99% of the time, when Riri Williams is on screen, we're having a good time. Even the moments with Queen Ramonda's death, the actress who plays Riri Williams knows how to put on a performance that makes you feel that loss. It's not just a super happy, giddy character all the time. The moments of loss, you really do feel it. And I think that, I mean, again, I'm not the biggest fan of that suit that she had at the end of the movie. I think the CG was a little bit weird. It was a little bit too smooth Power Ranger-like for me. But character-wise, she is so great. I'm so excited to see the Ironheart show. And I mean, I've been generally excited for the show, but now I'm more excited for Riri Williams herself. Not even like the Iron Man stuff, like not the like suit, not any of that kind of stuff. The villain, I don't care, Mephisto, whatever. I'm just excited to see more of the character of Riri Williams because I had such a great time with her character in this movie. But now to talk about, of course, the mid-credit scene. There was no post-credit scene in this movie, but I'm also going to talk about like the ending and the mid-credit scene here. I thought the ending was absolutely insane. I thought it was so great. Like I said before, that was like when I cried the last like 2 minutes whenever she goes down to the beach. She tells Nakia, like, I'm going to go alone. She burns the piece of like her clothing that she wore at T'Challa's funeral. And then you have this just absolute silence and you just hear the wind. And then you just see these flashbacks of Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa, of course. And you have this like, I don't know what it was, but it was like this blur, like this like circular blur. And it's just focused on the center of the frame where T'Challa is. And that really, I don't know what, maybe it was like the mix of like the atmosphere and like the theater was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop because there was no noise coming from the movie and the entire theater was dead silent. And it was just playing through these memories. The wind was blowing and like, it just, I don't know what it was. It was such an emotional moment. And it's not even like the entire movie built up. I mean, it did on a thematic level, but it wasn't like teasing like, oh my God, flashbacks of T'Challa. Like it wasn't teasing any of that stuff. It was just like, it just happened. And it happens at the perfect moment. It's the perfect audio. It's the perfect SFX, VFX, whatever mix you want to talk about on the editing level. It is just perfect. It's perfectly executed. And you cut to the credits and then you have the mid-credit scene where Shuri's still sitting on the beach. And again, that performance by Letita Wright is absolutely insane, right? And then you have Nakia walk down and she introduces T'Challa's son, T'Challa, which they named Prince T'Challa, obviously. And they explain the fact that like why he wasn't in Wakanda, why they didn't attend the funeral, and the fact that Queen Ramonda actually got to see him. And all of that is just so perfect. I do think this is possibly the MCU's best post credits or mid post credits scene, whatever you want to call it, because it doesn't necessarily feel like they're like teasing the future, but it's not done in like a commercial way. Like a lot of post credit scenes are done in a commercial way where it's like, oh my God, you see this, you see what happens next. Like I think Multiverse of Madness, as much as I love the movie, the post credit scene seeing Clea might have been one of the most weird post credit scenes ever because you end the movie with him opening his third eye and you're like, oh my God, what happens next? And they explain exactly that in the post credit scene. It's like this one takes place literally seconds after the actual movie ends. Yet it still feels natural and it still feels like you have that emotional punch. And it's not just like a 15-second, 30-second tease of like someone, putting on the gauntlet, you know what I'm saying, like Avengers was. But it's like this emotional, I think it was like around 2 minutes, 30 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. That's how long the post-credit scene was. And it was just an emotional moment. And I love that they did that. I love that they took the time. And that itself felt like a tribute to Chadwick Boseman. I mean, obviously, right before that, we had the flashbacks and stuff like that. But that moment itself felt like a tribute, like, okay, this legacy is living on within another character. And it didn't feel like the kid was like trying to do too much. It just felt like the perfect amount of acting from everyone on the screen at that time. I don't know how else to describe it. I just thought it was like the perfect possible post-credit scene that you could have for this movie. But guys, those are all of my thoughts on Black Panther Wakanda Forever. I'm super excited to keep talking about this movie. Thor Love and Thunder was very underwhelming because I disliked the movie and I just didn't even want to talk about it. That's how much I didn't like it. But this one is the complete opposite. I love this movie so much. And I think there's so many conversations to have about this movie, both on like thematic levels, just emotional levels. And again, let me know what you guys thought of this movie as well as what do you think of the future of the Black Panther movies in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.